Get out of my house, Soren. The words sliced through me like a blade straight to the heart. I stood there frozen, my hand instinctively protective over my stomach where our child's tiny heartbeat had just been confirmed 2 weeks ago. Jensen stood before me like I was a stranger, like the 3 years we'd spent building a life together meant absolutely nothing. Just 14 days earlier, he'd held me close in our bed, breathing in my scent at the curve of my neck, whispering those 3 precious words I'd believed with my whole soul. Now his eyes held only disgust, and I couldn't understand how everything had crumbled so completely so fast. 3 years of marriage. 3 years where I'd given up my dreams, my independence, every piece of myself to make him happy, and tonight, as thunder cracked outside our windows and rain battered against the glass, I stood before my alpha begging him to listen, only to realize that love doesn't just fade, sometimes it dies violently, taking everything you believed in with it. Jensen, please just hear me out. My voice trembled despite my attempts to stay strong. I needed him to look at me, really look into my eyes and see the truth written there. But he jerked his hand away from mine with such force that I stumbled backward, my shoulder hitting the wall. The omega inside me whimpered in fear and confusion. We're taught from birth that an alpha is our anchor, especially during pregnancy when our bodies and instincts scream for their protection and presence. But right now, Jensen's scent, once my greatest comfort, pine and rain and home, had turned toxic, contaminated with someone else's fragrance. Vanilla and jasmine. Landon's scent. His ex-boyfriend who I'd foolishly thought was ancient history. The alpha Jensen had loved before me, the one he'd never truly forgotten. And now Landon had returned, and apparently Jensen had already made his choice. I don't want to hear anything from you, Soren. Jensen's voice was ice, each syllable calculated to wound. You've made a fool of me. This baby, he gestured toward my stomach like it was evidence of a crime. This is nothing but your manipulation, your trap to keep me tied to you. I wanted to scream that this child was created from love, from the nights he'd held me and promised forever, but only a broken sob escaped my throat. Tears I'd been fighting spilled down my cheeks as my hands moved to cradle my belly, as if I could somehow shield our baby from this nightmare. But the cruel reality crashed over me. Jensen's heart belonged to Landon now, and I was just an obstacle to be removed. You have until morning to pack your things and leave, he said with terrible finality, turning toward the bedroom we'd shared for 3 years. The door slammed shut, the sound echoing through our home like a death knell. I stood alone in the living room, rain now falling softer outside but my heart pounding louder than ever. My legs gave out and I sank to the floor, pulling my knees to my chest as carefully as my early pregnancy would allow. Everything I'd built my world around had just shattered. My alpha, my home, my dignity, gone in moments. All I had left was this tiny flutter of life inside me, a soul that didn't yet know how unwanted they were by their own father. I wiped my tears roughly and made myself a promise in that moment. If Jensen was abandoning us, fine, but I would never abandon this child. Never. The next few hours passed in a blur. I moved through our home like a ghost, packing only what I could carry, my clothes, a few personal items, the small canvas bag that held my art supplies, the only pieces of myself I'd managed to keep despite Jensen's constant dismissal of my painting as a worthless hobby. My hands shook as I looked around the bedroom one final time. Our wedding photo sat on the nightstand, both of us smiling like we believed we'd found forever. I left it there. That version of us was dead anyway. By the time pale dawn light started filtering through the windows, I stood at the front door with 2 suitcases and a backpack. I paused, my hand on the doorknob, part of me desperately hoping Jensen would appear, that he'd realize his mistake and beg me to stay. But the bedroom door remained closed, silent as a tomb. He couldn't even be bothered to see me leave. I stepped out into the early morning air, the city just beginning to wake around me. The rain had stopped, but everything was still wet, puddles reflecting the gray sky. I had $47 in my wallet. No job because Jensen had convinced me to quit to focus on being a good Omega mate, and nowhere to go. My family had cut me off when I'd bonded with Jensen against their wishes. They'd never approved of an alpha who couldn't provide stability. I had no close friends left after years of Jensen discouraging my relationships, saying he should be enough for me. I was utterly alone. I walked for blocks, my suitcases growing heavier with each step, until I found myself in front of a small diner. Through the window I could see the early morning crowd. Construction workers, nurses, finishing night shifts. Insomniacs seeking coffee and conversation. Normal people living normal lives, completely unaware that mine had just imploded. I went inside and ordered the cheapest thing on the menu, a cup of tea I couldn't even taste, and pulled out my phone. The search results for homeless shelters near me made my stomach turn, but I forced myself to read through them. This was my reality now. But then another thought struck me, and I found myself searching for something different. Affordable studios, Brooklyn. If I could just find somewhere cheap enough, I could make the $47 stretch until I figured out my next move. I scrolled through listings, each one requiring first month, last month, and deposit that I couldn't possibly afford. As despair started closing in, I noticed my reflection in the diner's window. I looked wrecked, eyes red and swollen, hair disheveled, skin pale, but beneath the devastation I saw something else flicker across my face. Determination, the same stubborn fire that had gotten me through art school when everyone said an Omega couldn't make it in such a competitive field. The same strength that had helped me survive my family's rejection. I'd overcome impossible things before. I could do it again. I had to, because this wasn't just about me anymore. I placed my hand over my stomach, feeling nothing yet but knowing life was growing there. I don't know how we're going to do this, I whispered to my unborn child. But I promise you, we're going to survive. We're going to build something better than what I just lost. And one day, we're going to prove to everyone, especially your father, that we never needed him at all. The tea had grown cold, but I didn't care. I sat in that diner booth as the sun rose higher, making plans. I would sell some of my belongings to get money for a deposit. I would find work, any work. I would paint again, seriously this time. Not as a hobby but as salvation. And I would show Jensen exactly what he'd thrown away. This was my new beginning. Painful and terrifying, but mine. And that had to be enough. 2 years later, I stood in front of New York's most prestigious art gallery, barely recognizing the life I'd built. A champagne flute rested in my hand while my 2-year-old son, Eli, laughed delightfully in his nanny's arms beside me. The contrast to that rain-soaked morning when I'd left Jensen's house couldn't have been more stark. Back then, I'd wandered the streets with nothing but 2 suitcases and shattered dreams. Tonight, I wore a designer suit. My artwork hung on these exclusive walls, and wealthy collectors were actually bidding on my paintings. The transformation felt surreal, like I'd stepped into someone else's existence. Those first months after leaving had been brutal beyond anything I'd imagined. I'd managed to find a tiny studio apartment in Brooklyn's roughest neighborhood, barely large enough for a mattress and a chair. The walls were thin enough that I could hear every argument and footstep from my neighbors, and the building's heat worked sporadically at best. I'd taken any freelance illustration work I could find online, designing logos for startups and creating digital art for websites, hunched over my laptop at all hours because rent was due whether I slept or not. The pregnancy had been miserable in those cramped quarters. Morning sickness hit me hard, and I'd spend hours curled around the toilet with no one to hold my hair back or bring me water. The Omega in me cried out for an alpha's care, for the biological imperative of having a mate during such a vulnerable time. But I'd learned to silence those instincts, to be strong enough for Some nights the loneliness felt suffocating, and I'd lie awake wondering if Jensen ever thought about us, if he felt even a flicker of regret. Then I'd remind myself that he'd made his choice, and I'd made mine. When my water broke at 3 in the morning, I'd taken a cab to the hospital alone. The nurses had asked repeatedly about my alpha, their concern evident when I kept insisting no one was coming. Labor lasted 18 agonizing hours, and there were moments I thought I might break completely. But then they placed Eli in my arms, this tiny perfect miracle with Jensen's stormy gray eyes, and my dark curls, and everything changed. Holding him, feeling his little chest rise and fall against mine, I understood what true love actually meant, not the desperate needy love I'd had for Jensen, but something pure and unconditional that demanded I become better, stronger, unbreakable. "I've got you," I'd whispered to Eli that first night, both of us exhausted and overwhelmed. "Whatever it takes, I've got you." And I'd meant it. I'd worked harder than I'd ever thought possible. While Eli napped, I really painted for the first time in years, pouring every ounce of pain and hope and fierce protective love onto canvas. My early work was raw, almost violent in its emotional intensity, but it was honest in a way my previous paintings had never been. I started small, displaying pieces at a local coffee shop that charged me nothing but asked for 20% of any sales. Most days brought nothing, but then someone bought a small abstract for $200, and I felt like I'd won the lottery. That's when Julian entered my life. He'd been visiting the coffee shop for a business meeting when my artwork caught his attention. I'll never forget watching him study my paintings, this elegant alpha in an expensive suit, his expression growing more intrigued with each piece. He'd approached me directly, bypassing the shop owner, and extended his hand with genuine warmth that I hadn't encountered in so long. "These are exceptional," he'd said simply, his dark eyes meeting mine with none of the condescension I'd learned to expect. "You have serious talent, but you're showing in the wrong venues. These deserve a real gallery." I'd almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Me, a struggling single parent barely keeping the lights on, in a real gallery? But Julian had been serious. He owned one of the most respected contemporary art spaces in Manhattan, and he wanted to represent me. Over coffee that afternoon, while Eli slept peacefully in his stroller, Julian outlined a plan for my career that made my head spin. He saw something in my work that even I hadn't fully recognized. The story of transformation of an omega reclaiming power in a world designed to keep us dependent. The next 18 months had been a whirlwind. Julian had been true to his word, dedicating significant resources to promoting my work. My paintings began appearing in group exhibitions, then got reviewed in art blogs, and finally caught the attention of serious collectors. The money started coming in slowly at first, then in amounts that let me move to a better apartment, hire a nanny for Eli, and actually breathe for the first time since Jensen had kicked me out. Julian had never asked for anything beyond our professional relationship, though I'd caught him watching me sometimes with an expression I couldn't quite read. He was patient and respectful in ways that reminded me not all alphas were like Jensen, though I wasn't sure my heart would ever trust one again. Tonight's exhibition was supposed to be my triumph, and it was. Critics had praised my latest collection, checks were being written, and my future finally looked secure. I should have felt nothing but joy. But then I saw him across the gallery, and my entire world tilted sideways. Jensen stood near the entrance, his eyes locked on me with an expression of complete shock. He looked older, I noticed distantly, new lines around his eyes, his hair slightly longer than he used to keep it. He wore the same leather jacket I'd bought him for our second anniversary, and something about that detail made my chest ache. For a moment I was transported back to that awful night, standing in our living room while he destroyed everything we'd built. The pain felt fresh and sharp all over again. Then Eli squirmed in my arms, demanding my attention with his toddler babble, and the spell broke. I looked down at my son, at our son, and felt my spine straighten with renewed strength. Jensen's gaze had found Eli too, and even from across the room, I could see the moment of recognition, the way color drained from his face as he truly understood what he'd walked away from. This beautiful child was real, not the manipulation he'd accused me of. The evidence of his terrible mistake was right here, thriving despite his abandonment. Julian appeared at my side, placing a protective hand on my shoulder. "Soren, there are some potential buyers who'd like to discuss commissioning work from you," he said warmly, though I caught the way his eyes tracked toward Jensen with sharp assessment. He'd heard enough of my story to understand exactly who that man was. "Of course," I replied, forcing my voice to remain steady. I turned away from Jensen without acknowledgement, letting Julian guide me toward a group of well-dressed patrons. As we walked, I felt Jensen's stare burning into my back, but I didn't look back. That chapter of my life was finished, and I'd written a much better story without him. But as the evening wore on and I smiled through conversations and negotiations, one question haunted me. What did Jensen want, appearing here after 2 years of silence? And more importantly, was I strong enough to face whatever came next? 6 months of working closely with Julian had taught me that not all alphas were built from the same blueprint. Where Jensen had been controlling and dismissive, Julian was respectful of my boundaries and genuinely interested in my thoughts. He never made decisions about my career without consulting me first, never treated me like I was fragile or incapable because of my omega status. The way he interacted with Eli was particularly striking. He'd play peekaboo during gallery meetings, didn't mind when my son's sticky fingers touched his expensive suits, and had even researched the best preschools in our area without me asking. It was the kind of thoughtfulness that made my carefully constructed walls start developing cracks. I told myself I wouldn't fall for anyone again, that Jensen had burned that possibility out of me completely. Yet here I was, noticing the way Julian's smile reached his eyes when he laughed at Eli's antics, or how he'd bring my favorite coffee without being asked, remembering that I took it with oat milk and cinnamon. These small kindnesses were dangerous to someone who'd spent so long in emotional isolation. I caught myself looking forward to our meetings, spending extra time on my appearance, and that terrified me more than I wanted to admit. Everything shifted the evening Jensen showed up at my studio. I was working late on a new piece, Eli already asleep at home with the nanny. When I heard the door open, I'd assumed it was Julian coming by with the contracts we'd discussed earlier. But when I turned around, my blood went cold. Jensen stood in the doorway looking like a ghost from a life I'd buried. The confident alpha I'd once known seemed diminished somehow. Shoulders slightly hunched, uncertainty written across his features, and his scent carried the acrid edge of stress rather than the commanding presence I remembered. Soren, he breathed my name like a prayer, like something holy he'd lost the right to speak. I set down my brush with deliberate care, buying myself seconds to compose the screaming chaos inside my head. "What are you doing here, Jensen?" My voice came out colder than I'd intended, but perhaps that was appropriate. 2 years of silence, and now he appeared in my workspace like he had any right to invade my sanctuary. "I came to apologize," he said, running a hand through his hair in that familiar anxious gesture. "I know it's been a long time, but I've been trying to find the courage to face you. To face what I did." Apologize. The word hung between us like something obscene. I'd survived pregnancy alone, given birth without support, raised our son through sleepless nights and financial terror, built an entirely new existence from the ruins he'd left me in. And now he wanted to apologize? Rage bubbled up from somewhere deep and primal, but I forced it down, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing how much he could still affect me. "Why now?" I asked instead, each word clipped and precise. "Why not 2 years ago when I was homeless and pregnant? Why not when your son was born and I had no one? Why appear now that I've made something of myself without you?" "Because I was a coward," Jensen admitted, his voice cracking. "And because Landon left me and I finally understood what I'd thrown away." There it was, the truth beneath his sudden conscience. Landon had abandoned him, and so he'd come crawling back to his second choice, the omega he'd discarded like trash. The realization should have brought me some kind of vindication, but instead I just felt tired. Tired of being second best. Tired of this man's ability to wound me even now. "Where's your beloved Landon now?" I couldn't keep the bitterness from my voice entirely. Jensen's face went ashen. "He went back to his previous partner 6 months ago. Told me I'd been nothing but a distraction. That he'd only returned because he was bored." The cruel poetry of that confession wasn't lost on either of us. Jensen had destroyed our family for someone who'd used him as temporarily as he'd once valued me. I turned back to my canvas, unable to look at his broken expression any longer. "I'm sorry that happened to you, but it's not my problem anymore. You made your decision when you threw me out. When you called our child a manipulation. When you chose to believe I'd betrayed you without even asking for the truth. I know I failed you, Soren. Failed both of you." His voice grew desperate now, pleading in a way the old Jensen never would have allowed himself. "But Eli is my son. I should be part of his life. I want to be his father." The audacity of that statement nearly made me laugh. "You stopped being his father the moment you accused me of trapping you. You don't get to claim that role now because your life fell apart and you're looking for meaning. Eli deserves better than a parent who sees him as a consolation prize. Please." Jensen took a step closer and I instinctively moved back. "I'm not asking to fix things between us. I know that's impossible. But let me know my son. Let me try to be the father I should have been from the beginning." Before I could respond, the studio door opened again and Julian walked in, stopping short when he saw Jensen. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as the two alphas assessed each other. some primal territorial thing happening that I wanted no part of. Julian's expression remained professionally neutral, but I'd learned to read the subtle tension in his shoulders, the protective way he moved slightly closer to me. Am I interrupting something? Julian asked, his tone carefully polite but his eyes hard as flint. No, I said quickly. Too quickly perhaps. Jensen was just leaving. But Jensen wasn't ready to retreat. You must be the gallery owner I've heard about. Julian, right? He extended his hand, though the gesture felt more like a challenge than a greeting. Thank you for taking such good care of my family. The possessive phrasing made my skin crawl, and I saw Julian's jaw tighten fractionally before he shook Jensen's hand with crushing brevity. Soren is my most valued artist, he replied, deliberately choosing words that established our relationship on professional rather than personal terms. Though his protective stance suggested otherwise. And Eli is a remarkable child who deserves every good thing. The unspoken subtext, unlike what you gave them, hung heavy in the air. Jensen seemed to shrink further under Julian's quiet judgment, and I found myself caught between these two alphas, feeling uncomfortably like property being contested rather than a person making my own choices. Jensen, you need to leave, I said with finality. If you want to discuss Eli, we can arrange a proper conversation through lawyers. But showing up here unannounced is not acceptable. Something in my tone must have convinced him because Jensen nodded slowly, defeated. I understand. I'm sorry for intruding. He moved toward the door, pausing at the threshold. I really am sorry, Soren. For everything. Then he was gone, and I sagged against my work table, suddenly exhausted. Julian was beside me instantly, one hand hovering near my shoulder but not quite touching. Always so careful about respecting my space even when offering comforts. Are you all right? He asked softly. I don't know, I admitted honestly. I thought I was over him, over all of it. But seeing him again, I trailed off, unable to articulate the confusing tangle of emotions, anger, pain, and underneath it all, a tiny traitorous flicker of something I didn't want to name. Julian's hand finally made contact, warm and steady on my shoulder. Whatever you decide about Jensen's role in Eli's life, I'm here. Not as your gallery owner or your colleague, but as, he hesitated, seeming to weigh his next words carefully, as someone who cares about you both very much. I looked up at him, really looked, and saw in his eyes what I'd been pretending not to notice for months. Julian wasn't just being professionally supportive or platonically kind. He had feelings for me, real ones, and had been patiently waiting for me to be ready to see them. The realization terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. Julian, I started but didn't know how to finish. How could I explain that my heart was simultaneously healing and breaking, that I wanted to trust him but Jensen had left scars so deep I wasn't sure they'd ever fade completely. You don't have to say anything, he assured me gently. I just wanted you to know you're not alone. You never have to be alone again, not if you don't want to be. And standing there in my studio, caught between the ghost of my past and the possibility of a different future, I made a choice. I stepped forward and let Julian hold me while I cried for the first time since that awful rainy night 2 years ago. I cried for the dreams that had died, for the love I'd wasted, for every lonely night I'd convinced myself I was fine. And Julian simply held me, asking nothing, offering everything, showing me what support actually looked like. When my tears finally stopped, I pulled back enough to see his face. Thank you, I whispered. Always, he replied, and something in that single word felt like a promise I might finally be brave enough to believe. My life had shifted onto a trajectory I'd never imagined possible. The New York Times featured my latest exhibition in their arts section. Collectors were placing orders months in advance, and I'd finally achieved the financial stability that let me enroll Eli in the best preschool Manhattan had to offer. Yet despite these victories, my heart remained tangled in complications I couldn't seem to unravel. The growing connection between Julian and me had become impossible to ignore, though I kept trying to convince myself it was purely professional admiration. Watching Julian play with Eli during gallery closings, seeing how naturally he'd swing my son onto his shoulders or patiently answer endless toddler questions, something inside me would soften dangerously. He looked at me sometimes with an intensity that made my breath catch, like I was something precious he was afraid to reach for. One afternoon he invited me for coffee at a quiet establishment away from our usual professional haunts. And the moment we sat down, I knew this conversation would change everything between us. "Soren, this might be crossing a line," Julian began, his usual confidence wavering slightly as he met my eyes across the small table. "But there's something I need to tell you, and I can't keep it inside anymore." My heart hammered against my ribs as I waited, both dreading and desperately wanting whatever he was about to say. "I'm in love with you," he said simply. No flowery speeches or elaborate declarations, just raw honesty that hit me like a physical force. "I have been for months now, maybe from the beginning. I understand if this complicates things, if you need distance, but I couldn't let another day pass without you knowing how I feel." The words hung between us, beautiful and terrifying. Part of me wanted to leap across the table and kiss him, to finally give in to these feelings I'd been suppressing. But the larger part, the part Jensen had been, recoiled in panic. "Julian," my voice faltered as I struggled to organize the chaos in my head. "You don't need to respond right now," he interjected gently, reaching across to squeeze my hand briefly before pulling back. "I just wanted you to know, whatever you decide, whenever you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'll be here. Take all the time you need." That night, I lay awake long after putting Eli to bed, Julian's confession replaying endlessly in my mind. Could I really open myself up to love again? Was Julian's affection genuine, or did he see me as some damaged project to fix? And even if his feelings were real, did I have the courage to believe in them? My gaze drifted to Eli sleeping peacefully in his crib, and a new question formed. Didn't my son deserve a complete family, the kind of stability I'd never been able to provide? The next afternoon brought an unwelcome surprise that shattered my already fragile equilibrium. I was alone in my studio, working through these complicated emotions on canvas, when the door opened to reveal not just Jensen, but Landon beside him. The sight of them together sent fury coursing through my veins like poison. This was the Omega who'd orchestrated my destruction, standing in my workspace with manufactured innocence painted across his delicate features. "Soren, please just listen before you throw us out," Jensen started. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from Landon. Blonde hair perfectly styled, blue eyes wide with fake remorse, every inch of him designed to manipulate and deceive. "I owe you an enormous apology," Landon spoke up, his voice dripping with theatrical sincerity. "I created the rift between you and Jensen. I fabricated evidence, manipulated situations, because I was selfish and cruel. I'm truly sorry for the pain I caused." I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of this performance. Did they actually think I'd fall for this rehearsed confession? "What do you both want from me?" I asked flatly, refusing to give them the emotional reaction they were clearly fishing for. "I want to be part of Eli's life," Jensen said, desperation creeping into his tone. "I know I have no right to ask after everything, but he's my son. I should have been there from the start, and I want to make that right now." "You forfeited that privilege 2 years ago," I shot back, anger finally breaking through my controlled facade. "When you called my pregnancy a trap. When you threw me into the streets. When you chose this," I gestured sharply at Landon, "over your own family. Eli doesn't need you. He has me. And that's enough." Jensen moved closer, reaching for my arm, and the contact sent revulsion shuddering through my body. "Soren, I'm not asking to fix our relationship. I know that ship has sailed. But I'm begging you to let me know my child. Don't punish him for my mistakes." "How dare you?" I hissed, yanking my arm free. "You're the one who punished him by rejecting his existence before he was even born. Now that your life has fallen apart and you're looking for purpose, you think you can just claim fatherhood. That's not how this works. Please, Soren." Jensen's voice cracked as tears began streaming down his face. He actually dropped to his knees in my studio, a pathetic display that might have moved me once. "I can't survive knowing I have a son out there who doesn't even know my name. I'm begging you." The studio door opened again, and Julian entered, freezing when he took in the scene before him. His eyes moved from Jensen kneeling on the floor to Landon standing quietly in the corner to me trembling with suppressed rage. The pain that flashed across Julian's face was unmistakable. He understood immediately that some part of my heart was still entangled with Jensen, no matter how much I wished otherwise. Julian didn't say anything, didn't demand explanations or insert himself into the confrontation. He simply looked at me with those wounded eyes, then turned and walked out. The quiet click of the door closing behind him felt louder than any slam could have been. I stood frozen between two alphas, one who'd destroyed me and now groveled for forgiveness, and one who'd shown me what genuine care looked like, but whom I was apparently incapable of fully trusting. Jensen remained on his knees. Landon shifted uncomfortably, and I felt the foundations of my carefully rebuilt life beginning to crack beneath the weight of impossible choices. Both of you need to leave, I finally managed, my voice hollow. Jensen, if you want to discuss Eli, contact my lawyer. We'll arrange something appropriate. But this, I gestured at the scene around us. This ambush ends now. They left without further argument. But the damage was done. Julian had seen my hesitation, my inability to completely close the door on Jensen, and I had no idea how to fix what I'd just broken. The following weeks tested me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Julian maintained professional contact but created clear emotional distance, his warmth replaced by polite courtesy that hurt more than anger would have. Meanwhile, Jensen called and texted constantly, each message a fresh plea for access to Eli, for forgiveness, for a chance to prove himself changed. I felt trapped between past and future, unable to commit to either direction. Eli's questions grew more frequent and pointed. Mama, where's my daddy? Everyone at school has one. Each innocent inquiry felt like a knife twisting in my chest. What answer could I possibly give that would make sense to a 3-year-old? That his father had abandoned us, or that his father was desperately trying to return? Neither felt appropriate, yet the questions wouldn't stop. Finally, I called Julian to request a meeting. We met at the park where Eli played on the swings, his nanny supervising while Julian and I sat on a bench several yards away. The early autumn air carried a chill that matched the atmosphere between us. You want to give Jensen another chance? Julian said quietly before I could even begin. It wasn't a question. No, I replied firmly, needing him to understand this crucial distinction. I don't want Jensen back. But Eli deserves to know his biological father. Don't I owe my son that opportunity, regardless of my personal feelings? Julian turned to face me fully, his expression pained but thoughtful. What about what you deserve, Soren? You've spent years sacrificing everything for Eli. When do you get to choose your own happiness? The question paralyzed me because I genuinely didn't know the answer. Had I become so consumed with being a good parent that I'd forgotten I was allowed to want things for myself? I don't know if I can separate the two anymore, I admitted. Everything I do, every choice I make, it's all filtered through what's best for him. Julian reached over and took my hand, the first real physical contact we'd had since that awful day in my studio. I'll wait for you, Soren. However long it takes for you to figure out what you actually want. Not just what you think you should want, but you have to promise me you'll really think about it, not just default to martyrdom. He kissed Eli's forehead before leaving, and I sat alone watching my son play, Julian's words echoing relentlessly. Was I being a martyr or just a responsible parent? The line had blurred beyond recognition. That evening, I finally agreed to meet Jensen at an upscale restaurant, neutral territory where we could talk without the ghosts of our past relationship crowding in. He arrived looking nervous, fidgeting with his napkin before I'd even sat down fully. Tell me the truth, I demanded without preamble. Why did you really throw me out? I want the whole story, no sanitized version. Jensen took a shaky breath and met my eyes. Landon came back claiming he'd made a mistake leaving me. He seemed so genuine, so regretful. And he paused, shame coloring his features. I'd never fully gotten over him. When he showed me screenshots of messages allegedly from you to another alpha, talking about how you'd trapped me with a pregnancy, how you were planning to leave once you got enough money from me, I wanted to believe they were fake, but he was so convincing. My stomach turned at the revelation. He fabricated all of that, and you didn't even think to ask me directly. I was a coward, Jensen admitted, his voice breaking. I was scared of confrontation, scared you'd confirm it somehow. Scared of everything. So I took the easy way out. I believed the lie because it gave me permission to choose Landon. I'm so deeply sorry, Soren. I destroyed everything good in my life because I was too weak to fight for it. What changed? I asked coldly. Why confess all this now? Because when Landon left me for his previous partner, he laughed about the whole thing, told me how easy it had been to manipulate me, how pathetic I was for believing obvious forgeries. He admitted the screenshots were completely fabricated, that you'd never done anything wrong. I've spent months drowning in guilt, trying to work up the courage to face you and Eli. Part of me wanted to feel vindicated hearing this, but mostly I just felt tired. You can see Eli, but only supervised visits arranged through legal channels. I won't keep a father from his son, but you and I, we're finished. That ended the night you threw me out in the rain. Jensen nodded, tears streaming down his face, accepting the boundary I'd drawn. As I drove home afterward, my thoughts turned to Julian, the alpha who'd supported me through my darkest period, who loved Eli without biological obligation, who'd shown me what genuine partnership could look like. The next morning, I went to Julian's office unannounced. He looked up from organizing paintings, surprise and cautious hope flickering across his features when he saw me. "I'm ready," I said without preamble, walking straight to him. "Ready for what?" he asked, though his slight smile suggested he knew. "To trust you, to give myself permission to love again. Because you were there when I had nothing, when I was broken and terrified, and you never asked for anything in return. You showed me what real love actually looks like, and I've been too scared to accept it." Julian's face transformed with joy as he pulled me into his arms. "I promise I'll never give you reason to regret this trust. You and Eli are everything to me." For the first time in years, I felt genuinely hopeful about the future. Not because some alpha was rescuing me, but because I'd finally learned to value myself enough to accept real love when it was offered. 6 months passed in a blur of positive changes. Jensen maintained regular supervised visits with Eli, gradually proving himself capable of responsible fatherhood. Our interactions remained cordial but distant. Whatever romantic connection we'd once shared had died permanently, and I harbored no desire to resurrect it. My heart belonged elsewhere now, to the alpha who'd earned my trust through consistent action rather than empty promises. Julian had become an integral part of our lives in ways that felt natural and right. Eli started calling him Papa Jules, spontaneously one afternoon, and watching Julian's face light up with pure joy at that man made my heart swell almost painfully. Even Jensen, hearing his son use that nickname during a pickup, showed only fleeting sadness before managing a genuine smile. Perhaps he finally understood that biological connection didn't automatically confer the right to the title of father, that had to be earned through presence and love. One evening, Julian invited me to dinner at an elegant rooftop restaurant overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Eli was home with his nanny, and something about Julian's nervous energy suggested this wasn't a casual meal. The city lights glittered below us like fallen stars, as we sat across from each other, the autumn breeze carrying the scent of approaching winter. "These past months with you and Eli have been the best of my life," Julian began, reaching across the table to take my hands in his. "You've both brought color and meaning to an existence I didn't even realize was gray before you arrived. Soren, I know our story isn't conventional, that we came together through struggle rather than simple romance, but that doesn't make it any less real." My heart began racing as he released one of my hands to reach into his jacket pocket. When he pulled out a small velvet box and dropped to one knee beside our table, I felt tears gathering even before he opened it to reveal a simple platinum band. "I'm not promising perfection because life isn't perfect," he continued, his voice thick with emotion, "but I am promising that I'll stand beside you through whatever comes, that I'll love Eli like my own, that I'll never make you feel less than the extraordinary person you are. Will you marry me, Soren? Will you let me spend my life proving that you made the right choice in trusting me?" "Yes," I whispered. Then louder, "Yes, absolutely yes." Julian slid the ring onto my finger and kissed me as other diners applauded, but I barely noticed anyone beyond the man holding me like I was something infinitely precious. When I arrived home that night, Eli took one look at my tear-stained but glowing face and asked with typical toddler bluntness, "Mama, why are you crying?" I scooped him into my arms, breathing in his little boy scent of baby shampoo and playground dirt. "'Cause we're going to be a real family now, sweetheart. You, me, and Papa Jules. Officially." Eli clapped his hands in delight, not fully understanding but feeding off my happiness, and I felt complete in a way I'd never experienced even during my marriage to Jensen. This wasn't about finding an alpha to validate my existence or provide financial security. This was about choosing a partner who valued me as an equal, who loved my son without reservation, who'd proven through action rather than words that commitment meant showing up day after day. We planned a small, intimate wedding for 2 months later. Nothing extravagant, just close friends and the family members who'd actually supported me through everything. Eli served as our ring bearer, looking unbearably adorable in his tiny tuxedo, carefully carrying the bands down the aisle with intense concentration. When Julian and I exchanged vows under a simple floral arch, promising to build a life based on mutual respect and genuine partnership, I finally understood what healthy love felt like. Jensen attended at my invitation, for Eli's sake, watching from the back row as I married another alpha. When he approached afterward to offer congratulations, I saw acceptance in his eyes alongside the lingering regret. "You're truly happy, Soren. You deserve all of this and more. I'm glad you found someone worthy of you." The words held no bitterness, just honest acknowledgement of what he'd lost through his own choices. I thanked him genuinely, no longer harboring active anger, just a peaceful recognition that some chapters close completely and that's okay. Eli now had 2 fathers, one who'd given him life and was learning to be present, and one who'd chosen him deliberately and loved him unconditionally. Both could exist in his world without negating the other. As I stood in my studio weeks later, Julian and Eli playing in the garden visible through the window, I studied the paintings lining my walls. Each piece chronicled different stages of my journey. The dark, violent abstracts from my early pregnancy filled with fear and rage. The softer pieces as I'd found stability and purpose. The vibrant recent works bursting with color and hope. My art had documented my transformation from broken omega to independent artist to confident partner, and I felt profound pride in that evolution. I'd learned that second chances exist, but only for those who've genuinely grown from their mistakes. I'd learned that an omega doesn't need an alpha to be whole, but that choosing to share your life with someone who truly sees you is a gift, not a necessity. Most importantly, I'd learned that the strongest love starts with loving yourself enough to refuse anything less than what you deserve. This was my story. Soren Rivers, the omega who'd been thrown away like garbage and rebuilt himself into something stronger, brighter, more authentic than before. I'd been shattered completely, but in reassembling the pieces, I'd created something better than the original. And now, surrounded by genuine love and hard-won success, I could finally say with absolute certainty, I was exactly where I was meant to be.